Hey guys, and welcome back to the Movie Club Emporium. This week we are talking about a movie that came out right at the tail end of last year. But we've run out of themes, at least until summer. So let's talk about some different movies. And we are starting off with quite the doozy, because we are talking about the at the time newest A24 movie, The Iron Claw. Written and directed by Sean Dunker. Read your own handwriting, Jason. Dunker. And of course, this stars Zac Efron, Jeremy Allen White, and Harris Dickinson, and of course the always fabulous and will always be one of my favorite parts of Creepshow 2's Holt McCallany.
Yes.
You probably know him from Mindhunters, but he'll always have awesome hair, and he's going to Hollywood because of it. The Iron Claw, and we'll get all the jokes out of the way early because this is not. This is a pretty deep movie. With that being said, Nick, I will let you start off. Do you want to kind of summarize or where we are with this movie, how your thoughts are, or kind of what the movie is about in general?
So, the Iron Claw has to do with the legendary wrestling dynasty family, the Von Erichs. The father, Fritz Von Erich, was a notorious heel wrestler in the 50s and 60s who gained a lot of fame and notoriety for portraying a Nazi villain in pro wrestling, which didn't exactly make him popular. And that actually plays into part of the movie because legend has it that a Holocaust survivor put a curse on him because of his portrayal of that. Because back when he was wrestling, they had to put off everything as being real. So people are like, "Oh, he's really a Nazi." Anyway, so he plays this wrestling character, and he goes on, and he and his wife have 6 sons. He goes on to start his own wrestling promotion right in the heart of Dallas, Texas, World Class Championship Wrestling. And he coerces or pushes his sons into going into wrestling. And there's 6 sons in all. And the family dealt with tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, a shocking amount, a lot of it happening in the space of about 10 years. And the Iron Claw covers some of what happened before the tragedies really got going and the aftermath and the fallout of the family. This is a real event that really happened. So I don't know, I'm on the fence of how much to spoil things. There's a lot of death. There's suicide. There's all manner of terrible things. And I said it's a very sad movie, but it's dealing with a very sad and very real subject matter of the absolute tragedy that was unleashed upon this family that did not let up. And you get to see some of what the sons getting into wrestling and the impact it's had on his life and the impact the way their parents were had on their life. The main character, the main focal point of the movie is the brother Kevin Von Erich, who is the oldest surviving brother. There were originally 6 Von Erich brothers. One of them, Jack, died when I believe he was 5 or 6 years old in just a tragic accident. I believe I think he got electrocuted and drowned in a puddle. It was one of those absolute freak accidents. But that kind of spurred things off, in a family and kind of set this idea in people's collective consciousness about there being a curse on the family. But Kevin, you get to see how he interacts with the rest of his family and a lot of his personal life. And you get to see the rest of the brothers and their unique personalities and what they did before wrestling and during wrestling, and follows along. You get to see it takes place over about 15 or 16 years of their lives. You get to see a little bit before that but it takes place from, I would say, the late 70s through the early to mid 90s is the time frame. So you get to see a very interesting two eras in wrestling in this movie of the more what was called the smaller wrestling territories and kind of the big 80s boom of pro wrestling. So that's the backdrop of the movie, and the movie just deals in, I say tragedy, just unrelenting tragedy. And it's a gut punch of a movie. Uh, so it makes me sad just seeing her talking about it. This movie had a very deep emotional impact on me. Um, and if you went in blind and and even if you didn't care about pro wrestling, I think you'd still get a lot out of this movie. Being a pro wrestling fan is not required at all to go in and enjoy this movie. So that's kind of the brief synopsis without going into far too much detail. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it is a movie that takes place in the world of wrestling. Uh, but to me, it definitely is more about kind of this relationship, the relationship of the brothers, uh, dealing with that, the expectations of family, and then again, just the utter grief that destroys this family, just like wave after wave. And yeah, growing up where we did, this was all wrestling before we got into wrestling, before we were old enough to even be alive somewhat or watch wrestling. But definitely growing up in Southwest Oklahoma, you knew the name Funk and you knew the name Von Erich. Whether you watched wrestling or not, you had somebody in your family that could tell you all about the Von Erich. Um, and yeah, trying to and even though in the movie they kind of combined two brothers into one to kind of almost reprieve a little bit of the grief, it's still very still, man, it's a tough sit. I definitely recommend the Dark Side of the Ring episode about the Von Erichs. Uh because you get the story, but you also get kind of Kevin in his own words talking about his brothers. And to me, that's the most heartbreaking part of this movie is not so much, yes, the events that lead to so many deaths, they're all tragic, but it's just first being these brothers dealing with it and then dwindling down to one brother dealing with everything just heaped upon him. Um I
And
don't know if he's going to get overlooked or not because this is a pretty stacked year. Uh, but I can't think of a lot of performances that are better than Zac Efron. Um,
yeah, Zac Efron being the main character,
mm,
Kevin Von Erich, and the sole surviving brother of the Von Erichs. Um, and that's the name of that Dark Side of the Ring episode, is The Last of the Von Erichs. Where the one area this movie absolutely excels is the performances, and it wouldn't work without a strong lead. Zac Efron has proven himself to be a very versatile actor. He does such a fantastic job of selling the just the heart-wrenching emotion of Kevin Von Erich and the things he goes to and the optimism and, living up to his familial expectations, being the oldest surviving brother. And, you know, this was not an easy role to pull off because it's a very emotionally deep role. Plus, he had to learn how to wrestle. And let me tell you, Zac Efron, he learned how to wrestle. Holy cow. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention he got incredibly jacked for this movie.
dude.
You know, Zac Efron, always very fit guy. Man, he was huge in this movie. muscular wise, he's still, the fairly short guy, but he looked like a big dude in this movie, and that impressed me.
Yeah.
And there was one scene where he's on the ring and like doing flips on the ring, and it's just like he's really doing it. And it's like he is that athletic. And had read some about all the rigorous training they went through to learn pro wrestling moves and get trained. I believe Chavo Guerrero
Mhm.
trained them. Let me tell you, it shows.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think Zac Efron should absolutely get nominated for an Oscar. I think who else should get nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor is Holt McCallany.
Yes.
As Fritz von Erich, the father, the patriarch of the von Erich family. He puts on a what I would say is the best performance of his career, and that's saying something because he's been in the game a while. But he put he portrays Fritz in a way that, to my understanding, seems pretty accurate to reality. Fritz centered his wrestling promotion for a lot of years around his sons, and that put a lot of pressure on his sons. And you can see that in the way his performance comes through of the lofty expectations that he puts on them, even when they're struggling, even when they're hurting or injured. It's like, you have to push through, you have to do this no matter what. It became quite apparent that the wrestling business came above his own son's well-being, and that's tragic. And you get to see a little bit. You get to see Holt McCallany in a flashback scene in the '60s, like doing some wrestling as well and playing his heel persona. I was, I was blown away by how well he did in this movie, and he stole quite a few scenes. But beyond that, I think the one exception, which I'll get to later, they did a stellar job casting this movie.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's like David Von Erich,
Mhm.
who was really blowing up at one point. I wasn't familiar with this actor,
For David,
but he acts
Harris Dickinson who played
Harris
David.
Dickinson. He's a tall guy like David was, and he looked the part. And when he got on the mic in the wrestling scene and cut a promo, he sounded like he had been doing that for years. I was impressed by how well he did that, and he added some levity to scenes. He had some funny parts, and there is some levity in this
Mhm.
movie. And between and between the sadness, there's some funny moments
Oh, the
because
scene
at the
at
end
the
of the day,
wedding. The scene at the wedding. That's probably my favorite scenes of the whole movie.
oh, it's excellent. It's Yeah, it's like thinking back. It's a movie that after I watched it, I just kind of sat there dwelling on it for a while and kind of letting it sink in. But you get to see it. I believe think it's 1983 or 1984 when the tragedy really starts rolling, and you get a good feeling of the brothers and their various personalities, which I think are very well fleshed out. Like Mike Mike Von Erich, another actor, not familiar with him, but I think that was one of the more difficult roles in it because he's the musician, the outlier. He didn't really want to go into wrestling. He's more interested in the production aspect, and that was shot down. He was pushed into it, and man, did it have dire consequences. His story arc was, out of the brothers who perished, possibly the most sad. How that
Yeah.
all unfolded. And there's some stellar acting because at one point he's dealing with the after effects of having some severe trauma and having to do a press conference, and it's man, that was some acting. The acting in this movie is incredible, and this is the kind of story that If you had some really crappy acting of people who couldn't really sell it, it could have been a bad movie. It could have been laughable, but it wasn't. I'm truly impressed by the cast and how well they pulled everything together, how well the justice they did to their characters, and putting in the time to do in-ring work. That was amazing.
Yeah. I will say, as far as filmmaking, you can definitely tell it's an A24 movie. It has that beautiful, smoky, soft glow of an A24 movie. It also has a scene that I really liked, but it's a scene similar to the ending of The Whale, where the movie gets oddly, almost supernaturally spiritual. And I won't give it away. And it's not bad, it doesn't take away from it at all. But I was just like, oh, I know why we did it, and the movie kind of probably needed it, but it's just a weird kind of turn there toward the end. I think you know what I'm talking about.
I do, which I I love that was the scene that made me tear up.
Yeah.
That scene. It was. Especially when they got to the dock.
Yeah.
It was a very bittersweet moment, but man, that's the one, that's it. That's where I cried a little bit. So, and there's several moments throughout which can do that to you in this movie. The filmmaking, beautifully shot movie. It's a period piece. It's set in the
Mm.
70s, 80s, and early 90s, and it always looks like it, with the wardrobe, with the restaurants, the cars, everything. That's something I always look for in movies because I'm looking for somewhere they messed up. Never saw it. I thought that was the time period at every step of the way. Uh, I know we spoke before. There was apparently some rumblings that people weren't terribly happy with some of the wrestlers they chose, like Ric Flair, like Harley Race.
Mm.
Guy that got to play Ric Flair. Here's the thing: there's only one Ric Flair.
Yeah.
He,
Yeah.
he's going to be a very hard guy to portray anyway, which is why it's like
Without it being a caricature or like
yes,
like a guy doing an imitation. Yeah.
that's why there'll probably never be a biopic, or at least a good one, on him, because it would be too difficult to pull off.
Yeah.
So I will say, I think the guy that got to play Harley Race, I think they nailed it. That was a great scene, and that dude, he looked like Harley Race.
And you get a little double dipping because Chavo plays the Sheik in it too.
Oh
So
yeah, that's
it's
right.
the most people have hated Chavo Guerrero since he changed his name to Kerwin White in 2005. That's for you, wrestling community.
The most baffling gimmick changes ever. And you get to see a blink and you'll miss it cameo by MJF as Lance Von Erich.
The fake Von Erich.
That was in a scene who was not actually a Von Erich brother. Fritz Von Erich, in his infinite wisdom, after one of his sons died, decided they needed another Von Erich brother, so recruited a guy to pretend to be a member of their family. It went poorly, to say the least. Real poorly. If you're like, that's an incredibly poor taste, you're not wrong. It wasn't very poor taste. And that's, I was kind of surprised that they didn't delve into that a little bit.
So from what I heard was that there was a lot more shot with him, but just a lot of it was just cut to kind of streamline more with the brothers, kind of focus that story. And same with kind of why they combined Mike and Chris into kind of one character.
So I'm going to go into a few of the things I took issue with. Going into it, that's the thing, I can't help it. I know a lot about this story. I do. My number one big issue, and the thing that had me reaching for my phone to look it up, was, as you just mentioned, they left out an entire brother. They did. They left out Chris Von Erich, who is the youngest brother, who also died tragically. I understand streamlining things, but I think that was such a massive misstep to leave out the brother. He was the baby brother of the family. he was he was a little kid when a lot of this was going on, and that kind of I think he kind of got lost in the shuffle. And he wanted to be a wrestler so bad, but he had a lot of health problems. He had brittle bones, he had asthma, plus he was drastically smaller. The brothers were 6'1" and above, and these for the most part pretty athletic dudes. And Chris is 5'5" and just with all these health issues, it was never going to happen for him. He was never going to make it as a wrestler, but he wanted it so bad, and I think that's part of the reason he ended up taking his life later on when he was only 21 years old. I think they did the family and especially Chris a disservice by leaving him out entirely. I don't think it would have been a huge deal to put him in the movie. I think they could have had him in there, and since he was a kid for so much of the story, had him in there in the background and kind of have that be part of the plot where he's more in the background. He's not as much the focal point, and he wants some of the attention on him, but his brothers are taking the spotlight. I think, and this whole thing about not wanting to add more tragedy to it, it's a tragic story. It's no matter what you do, it's a tragic story, and having more tragedy and being more true to life, I think Chris deserved to have his story told. And I hate that he didn't. That was the thing that bothered me more than any other. I also wondered if part of the reason he didn't throw him in there was they made some interesting casting choices in this movie. One casting choice I had a problem with from the beginning was Jeremy Allen White as Kerry Von Erich. Kerry Von Erich was a big dude. He was 6'2", about 260 pounds. He looked a lot like the Ultimate Warrior, just stacked muscle.
Well, physically, Zac Efron looks like Kerry Von Erich. Like aside from that terrible He-Man haircut, but just his physique, he's just
yes,
muscles in a bag. It's just insane how ripped he was.
But it's like Kerry was even bigger than that. I mean, you see some of the pictures, especially the mid to late 80s, when he was on a lot of steroids, admittedly. He was huge. Jeremy Allen White is about 5'7" and weighs about 150, 160 pounds. He's a smaller guy. That's okay. And I figured, there's a lot of ways you can make a person look bigger in a movie. But all the shots of him, it was quite apparent that he was a very small guy. And that kind of took me out of it a little bit. Plus, I don't think his accent was that good. And I just don't think, from what I know of Kerry, I don't think he really captured Kerry very well, physically or performance-wise. And Jeremy Allen White's a very good actor. I just think this is a case where it was miscast. I know a lot of other people don't feel that way, but everyone else in the movie I bought without question. He was like, and I know Zac Efron, he's shorter than Kevin Von Erich. He is. But he had the presence and looked bigger. Yeah. I just couldn't buy Jeremy Allen White as Kerry. I couldn't. Yeah. They had to get the smallest guy of the brothers to play the most jacked brother, and it was weird. But it didn't work. I think, accent wise, the other people in the movie did really well, and it's just Jeremy Allen White sounded kind of artificial. That's two of my issues. I have more, but I'll let you chime in.
No, I know we couldn't dive as much into the WWF stuff because, the WWF wouldn't sign off on it, but I kind of wanted to look because that's what I know of their wrestling footage is those old WrestleManias, having those on DVD and seeing, Texas Tornado wrestling. And there's, I believe it's that and then the foot stuff. We really should lean into the foot stuff because there's a match. So if you don't know, he was in Kerry Von Erich. He was the one who kind of broke out. He got to the big league. I know David had gone to Japan and was going to wrestle for All Japan, perhaps New Japan, but Kerry was the one that made it. He made it to the WWF. And he did so even after a horrific motorcycle accident where he lost his foot. and he wrestled with a wooden foot wrapped in like a stocking in his shoe. And I think you can even find the maybe you can find the match online. There's a match of him and Mr. Perfect having like a banger 5-star match, and the guy's wrestling on one foot in like a club. But yeah, like I kind of like you said, he's so small. He's so small, and I remember I haven't watched The Bear, so I don't know a lot of his acting. I haven't watched The Bear. I haven't seen Shameless, so I wasn't really aware of like how well of an actor he was. But yeah, just even in the trailers and stuff, you're just like, he's the little one. Like
Well,
he honestly could have been the young one. Like if you were gonna do that last brother, have him play
that's
the
an
little
issue.
one.
When they announced it, that's what I figured. I figured he's going to play Chris, and I think he could have done very well in that role. They're very similar in size, which is kind of, you know, if you wanted somebody who looked like a runt next to him, you'd have to get somebody who's 5 foot tall.
Yeah.
You know, that's and that also presents a problem with casting of throwing Chris in the movie because of some of the people they chose. Uh, yeah, I that really surprised me that they didn't go more into that. You know, because there was a match that Carrie was a part of in which his boot with his prosthetic foot in it came off in the middle of the match and it was exposed. He managed to keep that a secret for years. It's a testament to how great of a wrestler he was. Wrestling is a very physical and very difficult thing to do. Doing it after a horrific motorcycle accident and missing a foot, that is amazing. And it goes into it. You see a little bit of the footage of Carrie training, you know, and dealing with immense pain, trying to uh, train for a comeback, you know, after this horrific wreck. And there was more. I think they could have done more with that. I think they could have. I would have loved it if they would have shown that match where that happened. And it's just such an embarrassing moment for him. And I think you could have shown more of his anguish, and it would have made the meaning of, you know, when he comes back to his house and he's strung out on drugs and dealing with all these issues, it could have given it more, you know, gravity. And it leads to another issue of I think this movie should have been longer. It feels more towards the end. The pacing is a little uneven, and towards the end, it feels like it kind of rushes through some things. In an era where 3 hour movies are normal, this could have at least been a 2.5 hour movie. It could have easily been a 3. And you could have covered more stuff. You might have been able to cover some of the aftermath because there was more tragedy
Yeah.
after that carried on into the 90s and all. And that being said, though, I think the ending of the movie I think it had the final scene is fantastic and heart wrenching. The pacing could have been better. It could have been longer. And I heard some people complain that it's like the movie goes, you get some backstory that is tragedy, 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 tragedy. I get that, and that's true to an extent. So, and I think making it longer would have fixed some of the pacing issues.
Yeah.
The pacing's not terrible. It's just it feels like it speeds up a bit too much towards the end.
Yeah, like it wants to it wants to end the suffering itself. Yeah, it's it's definitely one of the best of this particular genre of wrestling movies. But no, I think it's a beautiful love letter to not just this family, but kind of um like I said, the idea of brothers and dealing with family loss and dealing with it as a family and being there for your family, whether blood or not, but just that kinship, uh and how you're able to handle so much, again, so much adversity. Because yeah, like you said, it didn't end when the all the stuff in the movie happens. Like you get into what happened to Fritz in his old age, and um, so much so that Kevin like packed up and like moved to Hawaii so he wouldn't lose his mind. But yeah, definitely check it out. It should be streaming on Max, I believe, because Max signed that A24 deal. There's several different documentaries. I highly recommend the Dark Side of the Ring episode on it because you kind of get to see Kevin himself kind of to talk about how great his brothers were. But it's such a sad story, but it's also a story knowing now that Kevin's sons are wrestlers and are kind of on that plateau of making it into the quote unquote major leagues of wrestling is kind of cool to see that even with all this tragedy that, if something's in your blood, it's in your blood and there's no escaping it. So yeah, but bring Kleenex because you're going to need it.
I know it sounded a little bit like I was being pretty harsh on this movie, and there were some things, partially just because of going there with knowledge, that I did take issue with. But make no mistake, I think this is an excellent movie. I think this is one of the best pro wrestling movies ever made. I think it's an extraordinarily well put together movie. The acting's amazing. I highly recommend seeing it. I think a lot of the people, if you go on without the awareness of what happened to them, you'll probably I doubt most people would have the same issues. Like I watched it with Tommy, and he absolutely loved it. He's one of his best movies of the year. And there were a few things that bothered me just because I knew, and that's not terribly fair to the movie on its own, because I think a movie should be able to stand alone on its own and on its own merits. I think it's great. I couldn't get over how great the acting was and just some of the beautiful scenes and the tragedy. And man, it takes a lot for a movie to make me tear up, and this one did it. And my wife, after we left, she had to like sit there in silence for a while, started crying on the way home. Yeah. It's that kind of movie. But I hope this gets some nominations. I really do. And if there's any justice, it will.
It's Zac Efron's time, man. He's been the best part in a lot of terrible movies. So but now that he's the best part of this really great movie, let's throw him a bone. But that is the Iron Claw. Next week, join us where we're going to lighten the mood just a scotch because my lovely wife has recommended that I watch and review a little movie called Zombievers. So, tune in for that next week. Really, really like hard swinging that pendulum from, heartbreaking awards movie to, Zombievers. So, until then, I'm sure you know what? I'm going to save all my wood jokes for next week. I don't want to push my limits. Until then, I will see you guys next time. All right. Bye.
Later, y'all.